Good afternoon. Hello and welcome to Thursdays with Friends, everybody. This is our online conversation on current issues. This is the 21st episode of Thursdays with Friends and the 23rd day of the Biden-Harris administration. The new administration has begun many initiatives to address some of the most critical issues we are facing today and to bring back a semblance of normalcy to our democracy and government. I'm the show's producer, Wesley Wolf-Bear-Pinkham. Here's our chat host for Thursdays with Friends, FCNL General Secretary Diane Randall, and her guest, Clarence Edwards, FCNL's top lobbyist on sustainable energy and the environment.
Thank you, Wesley. Thank you for being our producer for all of these episodes and for all the great design work you do on behalf of FCNL. And welcome, friends. It's really, really wonderful to have you with us today to talk about those first executive orders that President Biden has enacted that deal with climate change and what we are anticipating could happen with Congress. I want to just say, I think probably everyone on this call has a couple of characteristics. One, my guess is you're probably all pretty passionate about the need to act decisively, urgently to address climate change. Secondly, I think you probably all pretty much understand that our advocacy is powered not only by the lobbyists who work in Washington on these issues, but by all of you around the country. And in addition to these important executive orders that President Biden has signed, we have actually seen some really important progress on the issue of the war in Yemen. And I just want to acknowledge that because I know that many of you helped us with that. Many of you over the years have talked to your own members of Congress. And so we are really pleased that this administration has called off offensive support for Saudi Arabia and UAE in the war on Yemen. I just needed to say that because that's really good news. Let's turn to our guest, Clarence Edwards, and I'm thrilled to have Clarence with us on this edition. Clarence started working with us last year in our Sustainable Energy and Environment program. He's our lead lobbyist and works with Mariah, our program assistant in that program. He has an intriguing background. He worked for the Australian Embassy, and he's also worked for the One campaign, as well as the Sabin Vaccine Institute. So he has a background in a lot of international work, in addition to his interest and knowledge in the issue of sustainable environment and energy. He's a graduate. He went to Baltimore Friends School, and he also did economic development work at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. So welcome, Clarence. And let's give you a start-off question to talk about what's happened since January 20th. What has the Biden administration done with some of these many executive orders, specifically the ones dealing with environment and energy?
Well, thank you very much, Diane, and thank you to everyone on the call today for joining us, all the friends and donors. It's been a very active time for the Biden administration and for climate issues just between January the 20th and January the 27th. On his first day in office, the president signed a document putting the U.S. on the path back into the Paris Climate Agreement. It takes 30 days to be enforced, went up to the UN, and the U.S. will be officially back in the Paris Agreement on February the 19th. Signing that was the easy part. What the administration has to do now is come up with a nationally determined contribution that puts us on the road to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by approximately 50% by 2030. And so that nationally determined contribution is being worked on now by members of the administration. In addition to Paris, that first day we saw a lot of action in terms of revoking the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, halting any efforts at drilling in the Arctic Refuge, also rolling back the previous administration's rollback of methane emissions. And all of these will go a long way towards supporting the US global engagement with other countries as we live up to our Paris Treaty commitments.
Thanks, Clarence, for that intro about the Paris Climate Accord and some of these executive orders. I saw that the Trump administration had made changes to over 100 environmental regulations. You mentioned one, which was methane, but can you say anything more about those rollbacks of the executive orders, specifically on some of the regulatory issues? Just give us an example of a couple of others, if you can, about where the Biden administration has made some changes that could impact the health of people specifically, but also might help us address climate change.
Well, I'll give you a good example, Diane. The administration has reinstated an interagency review on the social cost of carbon. And it didn't get a lot of attention, but it's really fundamental because accounting for the social cost of carbon it goes to the heart of something we at FCNL have been very interested in, which is putting a price on carbon and carbon emissions. So having the regulatory agencies take a serious look at the impact of carbon on communities and on people's health is, I would say, it's central to the work that we're doing at FCNL, and it's also central to having a true accounting for the impact of carbon and other greenhouse gases on the American public.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've been talking about that I think is so, I mean, obviously people who followed FCNL know that we have been focused for many years on engaging a bipartisan dialogue on the price of carbon. And we want to talk about that because I know you're anticipating several bills to be rolled out and have been tracking that very carefully. But the other issue that one of the things that I think is so exciting about the Biden administration is just that they've named experienced people to lead in various sectors around the environment.
Right.
And they've also named environmental justice as a real priority. And maybe before we turn to talking about Congress, which is really where we want to engage all of you a great deal, what's your sense about just talk for a minute or two about environmental justice and how you see that might play in the next 4 years of this administration?
Well, it's really interesting. Environmental justice has been an issue that it's gotten a lot of attention, obviously, in the past couple of years or so. This is an issue with deep roots in America's political history. I think you could say that it goes back even as far back as 1968 and the Memphis garbage strike and Martin Luther King traveling down to Memphis, where there were protests by members of the African American community over the working conditions and sanitation workers striking over poor working conditions. And then in the 1980s, in the early 80s, there were issues around the dumping of waste in Warren County, North Carolina, which really touched off the environmental justice movement. But this has been an issue, it's a long-standing issue. Other administrations have really made efforts to address it. Unfortunately, the previous administration made little or no effort to address it. But with the Biden administration, they've really raised it to a level of centrality in their environmental efforts, in their environmental outreach and engagement. And they're going to be taking something that's very interesting is the whole of government approach that the Biden administration is pursuing with environmental justice. So that going forward, it's not only going to be the job of the Environmental Protection Agency, but it's also incumbent upon other agencies, including the Department of Justice, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Transportation. So I think that this whole of government approach that we're going to see from the administration is really going to go a long way towards not only centering the issue, but getting us some real robust action, and something that we're working at FCNL to see some really robust funding to address environmental justice, because it is an issue that has suffered from not only a lack of attention, but also a lack of funding over the years. And that's something that we want to see change.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this. As I've shared with Clarence, I've had an opportunity to participate in a coalition conversation around price on carbon with environmental justice advocates as well. And it's been really enlightening and positive. And so I'm really excited that FCNL is turning our attention this way. So let's talk a little bit about, in addition to the executive orders, what you anticipate coming out of the administration in terms of legislation they might propose, they might be sending to Congress. And then let's turn our attention to talk to Congress and what we might expect to see. We have carefully tracked the carbon pricing bills in the past. And as people know, we have a great comparative chart of the carbon pricing bills that were introduced in the last session. So let's start with the administration and where you think we might begin to see some proposals that would come to Congress from the administration.
Well, I think there's an interesting sequencing that is going on right now between the Congress and the White House as the president and his team are really focused on the immediate need for relief from the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that is in addition to the impeachment trial. But what the real action taking place right now is a focus on COVID-19 relief. Interestingly enough, in the COVID-19 relief package that the Congress is about to consider, there is $100 million for environmental justice programming, which we were surprised and pleased to see that pop up in this bill. The administration is working very closely with House Democrats and Senate Democrats on how to structure their next initiative in terms of climate. We expect that to be probably in mid-March or so. It will be centered around infrastructure because, as the president has said, when we're talking about climate and we're talking about addressing these issues, we're talking about, as they say, build back better. So this is about how do we create jobs? How do we build a low carbon economy for the future that has jobs and opportunity for everyone? So we expect, well, we know that the administration is working closely with Democrats in the House on specific legislation. We're not sure where the administration stands on carbon pricing, although the Treasury Secretary has expressed her positive views on carbon pricing in the past. So behind the scenes right now, I think that there is a lot going on how you actually structure legislation to get at the issue. But we're expecting, as I said, in mid-March to see the administration start to roll out their initiatives. And we've been working very closely at FCNL with members of our coalition groups and the Interfaith Staff Committee and some of the other coalitions that we're a part of to keep an ear to the ground on what is happening around this legislation, around carbon pricing, and around environmental justice legislation as well. So just a shorter answer to your question is, believe that the administration's strategy right now is more to let the congressional Democrats using legislation that they've introduced in the past, including the Environmental Justice for All Act and various pieces of carbon pricing legislation that were introduced in 2020 and 2019, and letting the Congress really lead on how it is structured.
So we have, every time we do one of these Thursdays with Friends, we include a legislative ask. And I believe our legislative ask, I think, is going to be put in the chat, and Wesley or Stephen will put it in. And I believe it's talking about that we continue to press for a price on carbon as a kind of transformational change that is significant, important, and not totally sufficient. I mean, we recognize that in itself, it will not reverse all the damage that has been done by carbon in our economy. But, people who have long advocated with this know that it has been a real slog over the last decade or so to get, particularly to get Republicans to even talk about climate change. So I'd love to hear your thoughts as you're starting to, visit in offices and tracking what's happening, both about the bipartisan conversation that's happening, and then a little bit more specifically whether you anticipate we'll see some of those same carbon pricing bills introduced by members of Congress that were introduced last year specifically?
I'll answer that. The last part of that first. We do anticipate some of those carbon pricing bills that were introduced last year. Congressman Panetta had one that he is likely to introduce again. We're actually talking to his office tomorrow. We've spoken to Senator Coons about his carbon pricing legislation. We've spoken to his staff. That will be progressing as well. We're right on the cusp, actually. This Thursday with Friends is coming at an interesting time because we are literally at the beginning of the journey that we're going to all take together in terms of working on these issues from a legislative perspective. And I anticipate within the next couple of weeks or so, legislation to be introduced in the House and the Senate that will focus on a carbon price. It will be closely modeled after the legislation that came out last year. And similarly with environmental justice legislation. With regard to conversations with both parties, obviously the Republican side of the aisle has not been as amenable to this conversation. I have to tip my cap to my predecessor in this position, Emily Wurzba, who did a lot of great work in reaching out across the aisle, bringing Republican members into the conversation. And so in a way, we're standing on the shoulders of the work that she did. I will be honest, it is not always easy to engage Republican offices in this conversation. But at the same time, I think that it has moved glacially. The conversation is moving along. Republican members have a very different view often of where the emphasis should be. And we listen and respect that. They have a greater emphasis and interest in technology and innovation. They have a real belief that technology and innovation is the way to go. And they're not necessarily wrong, but we just want them to go further than that. So technology innovation is key to this, but also having conversations around the issue of a price on carbon. And I often remind my Republican friends on the Hill that, some of the initial thinking on a price on carbon actually came out of conservative members of Congress and conservative think tanks. And because it is a market-based solution, it's addressing a market failure. To be honest, the fact that we haven't put a price on carbon or we didn't do it decades ago was basically a market failure. And so we are able to have open and honest conversations. And there are members on the Republican side of the aisle who see the usefulness and the need for a price on carbon. The political dynamics of the US and the Republican Party right now being what they are, it's not always easy for them to get there publicly. But to be honest, what we're hoping is that the groundswell of support that is starting to well up around the need for a price on carbon, which is coming from people like Janet Yellen, which is coming from the Business Roundtable, the Climate Leadership Council, and other groups who see this as a really viable and sensible solution. We're hoping and expecting that that's going to put the wind beneath the wings of some Republican members.
Thank you for that, and for kind of taking this out. I mean, sometimes those of us who really come at this work from, a deep and abiding concern for the planet and the welfare of people, you don't always think of business as partners, but in some cases, we know that there has been movement, albeit slowly, in some ways, and as you noted, not nearly as dramatically perhaps as that we would push. But I think that's when we think about how legislation gets crafted, it usually isn't only one view that gets considered. And we have gotten a couple of questions in the chat, and one of them specifically asks how President Biden's initiatives might work with Republicans. I mean, do you have any ideas about sort of whether the president might have particular ways to engage Republican leaders on this issue? Any perspective on that?
I do, and as many of us have seen in the news, the president often refers to his longstanding friendships and relationships in the Senate, and I think that we're going to see a return to a sort of that one-on-one direct lobbying and the kind of frankly deal making that Washington has relied on in the past. I think that he has persuasive powers. I think he's committed to this issue, and I think that you're going to see a lot of his direct involvement. The president has already raised climate to the forefront of his administration's goals. And so I think he will be directly engaged in a lot of ways with this issue. He's built out a legislative team that has significant experience on Capitol Hill. So that's a real signal that he's going to place a lot of emphasis on rebuilding the engagement and relationship between the Congress and the White House. So I think it will be a lot of personal lobbying and politicking on the part of the president, and a willingness to understand and hear where Republicans are coming from on this issue. I think he understands that, and I frankly think that Republicans will find that they have someone who will listen to where many of them are coming from.
Thanks, Clarence. One of the things that, when we think about like where we were, as I said earlier, I think that people who have been involved at the FCNL network for a long time have helped move this conversation and really helped. I mean, I've actually talked to Republican lawmakers who've told me how influential their constituents were in getting them to be engaged and be active. And so I'm going to ask you before the end just to like think a little bit about what you really want our network to do. But before we go there, I know we're going to get some more questions, but one of the things I want to give a slight pitch for is that you and Mariah put together a monthly newsletter that is available to anyone who wants to subscribe to it. And we don't put people on our newsletter list automatically, but if anyone's interested, we do have a newsletter called
Inside the Greenhouse, right? Exactly.
And just say it's a way to kind of get this kind of update, right? Without, in print once a month.
Absolutely. Inside the Greenhouse, and my colleague Mariah Schreiner does a fantastic job of putting it together. But Inside the Greenhouse is a way that we can communicate with our FCNL constituency, but also with people who may be outside of the constituency. And we can give you a little bit of insight into what's happening in Washington on Capitol Hill, how issues like rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, how that's coming about, what's happening on the legislative front. So please sign up.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we have a handful of newsletters, and this is a great one that we put out. We have a few minutes left, and we certainly would like to have more questions, but we do have a specific question about the National Renewable Portfolio Standards, especially the question about carbon pricing. And this gets into a little bit more details, but there is a big, some of the controversy over putting a price on carbon is what is the price per ton and what happens to the revenue that comes in from that. So I don't know whether you feel like you want to, there's so many different options but what are the considerations when you think about the principles that FCNL has put together in terms of how the pricing has to happen and how we think about the revenue coming in?
Well, two things. There is a debate going on within the Democratic caucus right now between what's called a clean energy standard. It could be called a renewable portfolio standard, a clean energy standard versus a price on carbon. And I was listening to an economist the other day who said, this doesn't have to be an either or. What we're likely to end up with is a mechanism that has elements of both a clean energy standard and a carbon price. Those who are opposed to a carbon price really worry about whether the price is set, as you said, Diane, at the right level. And in our conversations with congressional offices, they're very cognizant of the need to ensure that a price on carbon is set at a per ton level that actually addresses the challenge. The other issue, the other challenge around the price on carbon is that many groups feel that a carbon tax or a price on carbon, the revenues from it won't go to the communities that are the most impacted. And I understand, and my colleague Mariah, we understand those concerns, and we've talked to various offices, and a lot of offices understand that concern. The key challenge is designing a piece of legislation around with carbon pricing in it that recognizes that challenge and that directs some of the funds toward communities that have been historically disadvantaged. And so that's a key consideration, but we also have to recognize that a price on carbon alone is not the solution to the challenges that we face in terms of environmental justice. It is a piece of the puzzle. And so we're also going to be advocating for, as I said earlier, alluded to earlier, more money for environmental justice, more grants for the global communities that have been harmed by the legacy of fossil fuel production in this country, and also for more grants for environmental justice activities at the state and local levels. So I'd like to say we're taking a holistic approach here at FCNL when we advocate for price on carbon and environmental justice. And it has to ensure that those communities that have been harmed in the past are getting redressed and do have an opportunity to benefit from at least some of the revenues that are brought in by a price on carbon.
I really appreciate the holistic approach that you mentioned, Clarence, because it is true. And I would say that, you know, one of the exciting things that we see at FCNL is that we have colleagues, Quaker colleagues, who are working on this. Quaker Earth Care Witness, and I know Beverly Ward's on the call, and she's been working down in Florida with the Quaker meeting, the yearly meeting down there. The Quaker United Nations office has been hosting these quiet conversations at the UN that have been really important. And so, and to say nothing of so many friends, and I think probably people on this call and people of goodwill who have determined how they themselves can reduce their carbon footprints and make a difference. And they've worked to influence local governments and state governments and even businesses. I mean, we are starting to see, someone mentioned a commitment Google's made to try to reduce their carbon footprint, but we've seen it also now with General Motors and electric cars and all that. One of the questions I just want to ask that's just come in, and see if you can answer it in the next couple of minutes, 2 minutes, is does or can FCNL ally with other faith groups, including evangelicals, to form a powerful faith lobby that would persuade people who haven't, members who haven't acted yet, people who are fence sitters, to take action? So talk a little bit about that, if you would.
I alluded to this a bit earlier, but through our Washington Interfaith Staff Community, we've allied with a range of other faith organizations because I believe that, and many others believe, that the faith community has a really significant role to play on climate issues. So we are working through that community. We're reaching out to other faith groups, which is something that in taking this job, I was really excited about doing, because I believe that the faith community's message and taking this issue above and beyond just the partisan politics and helping to remind members and government, whether it's the US government or other governments, that this is about the human relationship to the planet and to the earth and to our home, where we live. And so that's a message that I believe that the faith community is really central to bringing that message. We have a real power in this community to get that message across, and that message resonates with people on Capitol Hill. So absolutely, we're working with other faith groups. I'm always on the lookout for other faith organizations to ally with. And so that's because I feel like we have a very powerful message to get across. Absolutely.
We do. And we have done work over the years with the evangelical network, and also with Catholics. I mean, certainly the Pope's encyclical that came out about 5 years ago, Laudato Si, was very powerful. a very powerful spiritual tool. Looks like we might have time for one more question. I'm going to squeeze in one more question because this is such a common question that happens, is about jobs. I raise this because it's something that we may be hearing from Senator Manchin of West Virginia, who's in a key place as coming from a coal producing state. What kind of message can you tell the listeners today about, like, how do you counter that if an elected official says, well, we're going to lose jobs if we do too much about cutting back on carbon?
Well, I would say to that member of Congress, respectfully, we're going to lose jobs if we don't make this transition. We're already losing jobs. This is not just the United States, but the world is making this transition. What we have the opportunity to do when we're shooting for a low carbon economy is build the economy of the 21st century. And there is a lot of concern over losing jobs in the coal industry, in the oil and gas industry. But if we get ahead of this and we take on this challenge of building this low carbon economy, jobs will come out of that. We're not just building windmills and solar panels, but really, and this is why the infrastructure bill and infrastructure legislation will be so central to this, because it's about building out a new economy, actually. You know, not to make it too big, but that's what it is. We're talking about building a brand new economy here. And so there are going to be jobs across the board that will be created by the actions that the administration and others are taking. So, you know, we talk about a just transition, and that just transition has to help those workers who've helped build let's be honest, the fossil fuel economy that the US has built since the Industrial Revolution has been a success. We're dealing with the downside of it now. But if we can deal with that downside, help the workers that help build this country, we can build out new jobs, healthier environment. It's, from my perspective, it's all upside. So I would say to that member, those jobs are in danger, but we can actually leap for the future and build something even better for your constituents and give them hope and opportunity.
And that's why you're such a great person to be working on the Friends Committee on National Legislation, because we do take that long view and we really know it's really essential in our advocacy. We're going to have to wrap it up. This has gone very quickly. I think.
Wow, it goes fast.
It goes fast, and there's still questions coming in. So we're going to try to respond to people offline on some of these questions. But any final closing words, Clarence?
Well, first of all, I'm always available if you have any questions. If you want to ask, you know where to find me at FCNL. But also, in the next several weeks, we're going to be reaching out to the FCNL constituency as this issue heats up in the Congress and as legislation is introduced. And we're expecting a legislation on carbon pricing and on environmental justice. So Mariah and I will be reaching out to ask you to be in touch with your member of Congress, but put your voice behind some of the legislation that we'll be sharing with you, and help us as we begin this process of reaching for a low carbon future.
Thank you, Clarence. Terrific closing words. And I'm just going to end by saying that we are grateful to all of you for your advocacy. We're grateful for your financial support. And just, I will say that one way that people provide financial support is that kind of long-term view about the future, because we have people who have made bequests, they've put us in their wills, they've made charitable gift annuities. So we are, I just want to plant that seed because that's another way that people can support us for the long term. So Clarence, thank you. I know you will be back.
Thank
People
you
are going to
very
get
much.
to know you much better in the coming months and years. So thanks so much for joining me today. And thank you, all of you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, take care, everyone. Oh, I forgot. Are we off? Can I just say that in 2 weeks, we're going to have Heather join us to talk about the authorization for the use of military force and the repeal. She's just put out a brilliant piece that's actually on our website, and she's going to be joining me in 2 weeks to talk about that. So I hope you'll all come back then. Thank you.